Ready? All set.
Welcome to this webinar hosted by SALALM, the seminar on the acquisition of Latin American library materials. Thank you for joining us to celebrate Gayle's achievement and learn more about Latin American and Caribbean screenplays in print. Gayle Williams will be presenting her most recent publication titled Latin American and Caribbean Screenplays in Print, an Annotated Bibliography. This work has been published this year by SALALM and is available via Project Muse for SALALM personal and institutional members, or available for sale via Project Muse for non-members. Gayle Williams has been the Latin American and Caribbean Information Services Librarian at Florida International University since September 2007 and will retire in December 2024. Gayle is from Oklahoma and now resides in her hometown of Oklahoma City. She has been the editor of the SALALM Bibliography of Latin American and Caribbean Bibliographies since 1992. Thank you, Gayle, for all those years. Gayle served as SALALM president for 1997 to 1998. Her publications include 2 books awarded SALALM's Jose Toribio Medina Award, The Index Guide to Latin American Journals, published in 1999, and Latin American Collection Concepts, Essays on Libraries, Collaborations, and New Approaches, co-edited with Jana Krentz and published by McFarland in 2019. She has served as a volunteer indexer for the Hispanic American Periodical Index HAPI since 1978. Thank you so much for that work, Gayle, as well. Gayle has been interested in Latin American film studies throughout her professional career. She has presented papers in conferences and published works such as the section devoted to film of the classic reference title, Latin American and Caribbean Studies, A Critical Guide to Research Sources by Paula Covington. She has also been very active in the SALALM Subcommittee on Audiovisual Materials since 1980, becoming its chair in 2010 through 2012 and 2021 through 2023. Gayle, congratulations on your bibliography on Latin American and Caribbean Studies in Print. I appreciate your detective and tireless efforts hunting these screenplays for your bibliography. Researchers, I'm sure, researchers around the world will appreciate your work. This is indeed a much-needed contribution to the field of Latin American film studies that brings together information about the screenplays that are not easy to find. Now, thanks to Gayle, we have a reference to consult and guide our users. This work is particularly useful for those researchers in film studies who normally just focus on the films themselves as primary sources for their analysis, but now having access to the screenplays will add a richer dimension to their research. I find it interesting that some screenplays have been published more than once by several publishers, and Gayle includes all the different versions in the bibliography. Let me give you an example. I'm sure most of you know the film Fresa y Chocolate. Fresa y Chocolate is a very famous Cuban film by Tomás Gutiérrez Jalea. I appreciate, Gayle, you including the various publications of the screenplay, and I wonder if they might include different versions of the script. I was fascinated by some of the publications that actually were including the script of Fresa y Chocolate. For example, one was published by Ediciones Vigía. I'm sure many people here know Ediciones Vigía is a well-known publisher of handmade books in Cuba. And it was actually edited by the founder of Ediciones Vigía, Rolando Estevez. I didn't know that. Now, thanks to Gayle's work, I know about that work. Another translation, and then Gayle includes actually translations of scripts. Like in the case of Fresa y Chocolate, Gayle includes an Italian translation, Fragola e Cioccolato, of that. So I find very interesting that you provide all these different entries in your bibliography. I'm also intrigued by the unfilmed screenplays. Thank you, Gayle, for documenting them in the bibliography. This can open unexpected future lines of research and shed new light on the history of Latin American film. Gayle now will be discussing the development of the bibliography as well as highlighting some of the many noteworthy entries, including screenplays by high-profile Latin American literary figures, as well as the many screenplays that remain unfilmed. You will have an opportunity to ask questions right after Gayle's presentation. Adelante, Gayle, cuando quieras y enhorabuena. Felicitaciones.
Gracias, Jesús, muy amable. The Fresa y Chocolate is not the only Ediciones Vigía volume for a screenplay. There's another one, quite interesting because and again, they just published it as the text. No explanation of what prompted publishing 2 Cuban films. Something else that we need to be able to figure out in the future. Okay, someone remind me, now that I have the PowerPoint up from screen share, but I need to change it to the full screen. How do am I supposed to do that before I put it on screen share?
You can, I think you should just be able to go to slideshow and it'll be fine.
You're right. Thank you, Katie. Except now, my problem is my space bar is only letting me go forward, backward.
Try using your arrow keys.
I was, and those weren't working either. Unless, let me try something. Okay, now I think I can. Okay, I have my computer is very idiosyncratic with the number lock key, and it doesn't light up when I put it on, something I intend to write HP about before I purchase another computer from them, another laptop. Okay, well, let's get started. What you'll notice, I'm going to go ahead and be very honest. This is a Frankenstein PowerPoint. I have done several presentations about this bibliography over the years, and rather than just go from scratch, I just went through them one afternoon and did a lot of copying of things. So you will see some repetitions, some idiosyncratic things. The fact that some of them still have the caption of the original title, Latin American Screenplays in print, as opposed to having and Caribbean, which was added at the suggestion of the SALALM Editorial Board reviewers. But I want to say I am very thankful as to finally getting this to appear. COVID, of course, stepped in and took away a few years, but also because I'll just mention here briefly, because I started this project in 1986. I was working on a different project on Latin American film, but when one day in the stacks at the University of New Mexico, where I was working at the time, I stumbled across a published screenplay for an Argentine film from the 1940s. And I was amazed. I shouldn't have been, because I already knew that just as plays get published, screenplays get published. And I was already familiar with US films and their screenplays being published. But this got me to thinking and looking and thinking, this is a project I could take on. What I didn't realize after a couple of years, what I realized was that I didn't have that much to even think about putting it forth as an article, letting alone a book. So I really just started back burnering it, and every couple of years when I was in the mood, I would get it out, shake it off. Certainly moving into the age of the internet made some things more likely. In 2015, when I was preparing for my 2016 semester-long sabbatical, that was for working with Jana on our edited book collection. But it occurred to me, I'm going to have time between editing those various papers, and that turned out to be true. There were lags even after our deadlines. But essentially, the 2016, oh my gosh, that means it's been 30 years I've been working on my screenplay bibliography, and maybe it's time to really get it done. So that was really when I hunkered down. So one of the numerical results are a listing of 638 books and articles of published screenplays for Latin American and Caribbean films. Now, since some of those titles include more than one, in other words, there are a lot of collections, it actually comes to 518 film screenplays, 270 unfilmed, a total of a listing of 788 screenplay titles. And again, the why was my initial curiosity and just my interests converging in terms of Latin film, but also as I started checking, screenplays were not widely found in film bibliographies, whether they were geared towards the region or general bibliographies on film, or the few general bibliographies that existed for screenplays. My focus is primarily on films produced in Latin America by Latin Americans, and we'll throw Caribbean into that. But I also include other publications regarding Latin American topics, and it eventually wound up with a couple of TV screenplays. So these are primarily commercially published screenplays that often do have a lot of great supplementary information, sometimes by the author, who might also be the director, about the making of the film, technical credits, film stills, which, you know, the books I started working with were in black and white and have started increasingly appeared in color. Also, another specialty was the fact that I encountered what I would call archival, or the actual shooting scripts that have made their way into a few US academic libraries. And then the majority of what I'm going to talk about here in my presentation is my fascination with the actual number of unfilmed screenplays. But as far as some of the other results, so what this does bring out is a corpus of, and this isn't a complete list per se, but these are some of the authors of screenplays with the highest count from a variety of countries, including Venezuela, and Colombia, which became interesting because I started working on this in the 70s, where, you know, it was really the period when those two countries were coming into their own for film production more so than ever. The one screenplay published most often is Buñuel's Los Olvidados from Mexico. And this is another one where for years I debated, should I put this one in or not? Because of course Buñuel is from Spain. And I, you know, some years I would think about it, and I had a little batch of stuff. I would start putting it into the overall manuscript. And I finally, when the birth of the internet, bringing in online national filmographies from the various cinematochs throughout the region, when Mexico includes the Buñuel Mexican film corpus as part of, in other words, they consider it part of their national film patrimony, therefore why shouldn't I? I'll also, so you'll see some of the stuff I just talked about is written up here too. So again, these are duplicates that I didn't want to trim down. But essentially, so again, what I primarily have are commercially published materials. The 60 archival scripts represent what are the holdings of thousands of the same kind of what would be scripts, not commercially published, found in the cinematochas in Latin America and the Caribbean. Okay, so again, it was really in the last, let's say, 8 or 9 years that as I was working on this and with a serious intent to finish the manuscript, that as I realized that I came across more and more publications of unfilmed screenplays, I it just became very intriguing. Why, if a screenplay didn't get filmed, why would it end up getting published? So what I've got here are maybe a few reasons that make sense, some that possibly don't. But I think some of them, and Jesus mentioned this, I think they do, some of them definitely lend themselves to further investigation of what went on behind the scenes. So here are some of mine, and I'm not going to use this one because I've got other slides for it. So again, some of the more obvious reasons that an unfilmed screenplay is published, they're the posthumous or forgotten works of directors. So in the case of Brazilian filmmaker Joaquim Pedro de Andrade, who best known for his film of Macunaíma, his colleagues had access to his 2 final screenplays and published them posthumously. Adriana Contreras, a lesser-known filmmaker from Mexico, and being a woman also makes her stand out. She made a tiny handful of films before her early passing, so her associates, and it's a very lovely book with lots of great color photographs from her work, but they made it clear that the text was meant to honor her passing by publishing one of her films, the screenplay of it, and an unfilmed screenplay as well. Glauber Rocha, there were several years after he passed away, yes, we have collections filmed screenplays, but he had created his first go at it at age 18, gave it to this friend, Fernando da Rocha Perez, who published it 6 years later. And you might think it's hard to find. It really isn't. It's held in U.S. libraries, though for lack of time, I treated myself and saw it and examined it in 2016 at the National Library of Brazil when I was in Rio for 2 weeks. Osvaldo Lamborghini only published 3 books and is considered kind of, in terms of Argentine literature, really knows what to do with him. He's, if nothing else, he's considered avant-garde. But he co-wrote a screenplay called Una Nueva Aventura de Irene Adler with filmmaker Dodi Schur. For those of you who don't know, Irene Adler is one of the very few characters highlighted in a Sherlock Holmes story. I think it's A Study in Scarlet. And they built on this character in the old Basil Rathbone movies and the more recent Robert Downey Jr. movies. But anyway, so this is the kind of thing that could lead itself for someone in comparative literature to look at this in meta-literary studies. Why do we have a fictional character by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle appearing in an Argentine text? Leading Latin American authors out of the boom period all had their hand at writing, but not getting certain screenplays filmed, unfortunately. Carlos Fuentes was quite interested, but is among the ones that didn't happen with. Interestingly, Horacio Quiroga, now of course he died in 1937, so films were around, and he only wrote 1. Gabriel Garcia Marquez stands out because, interestingly, he wrote a screenplay that was meant to be for a production on French television regarding the Sandinistas and a jailbreak called Viva Sandino. And again, it failed to appear. It didn't get made, but he made the copyright freely available to anyone. So for that reason, it's actually, if you look at the bibliography, it is actually, and I was scribbling notes, so I'm going to them here. It's been published several times in several countries under a couple of different titles. Yeah, there's 7 editions of it, published with 3 different titles in Spanish, German, Portuguese, and Italian. So again, kind of, you can ascribe that to his importance and popularity. Something that's obvious, but perhaps not so obvious, is that there are a number of screenplay competitions in classwork included in the bibliography, both university level, but in one case, I've got 2 volumes done for a competition at a Brazilian high school in Rio Grande do Sul. The one that's most significant in this grouping is the 1987 collection Cine de la Violencia. This was a screenplay competition in which the screenplays focused on the theme of violence in Colombian society. It published 6 of them. 3 had been made into films by the time the work in 1987. 3 to this day were never filmed. So there are a lot of these, and whether or not anyone really thought any of these would get made into a screenplay, that's another matter for discussion. Of course, you have a lot of screenplays, filmed or not, looking at preeminent Latin American historical figures and events. And all of you know who these are, except perhaps for Felipe Carrillo Puerto. He's up there because there's an unfilmed screenplay written by the eminent Mexican playwright Emilio Carballido, simply because he was a Mexican socialist, the founder of the Universidad Autónoma de Yucatán, and they published the screenplay. Again, there's nothing in it to say why. I'm assuming that they might have commissioned him to write it, but again, it doesn't give that as a detail. Few more. And then one that I just found of interest, unfilmed screenplay, Las Dos Juanas de América, written by Laura Cortinas, who is a friend of the Uruguayan poet Juana de Irbarboro. And this led her to write a screenplay about the 2 Juanas, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz and Juana de Irbarboro. Another one that I found especially interesting is an unfilmed screenplay, is this Mexican work, Murió por la Patria los Niños Héroes de Chapultepec. So this is a writer Alfonso Tejazabre was a Mexican politician and writer and was infatuated with Mexican history. His foreword notes that he thought that this was such an important event in Mexican history. And for those of you who might not know, but very quickly, the last few adolescent cadets at Chapultepec Castle, which by then was the military academy, were charged with preventing the incursion of American troops into the castle. They died fighting, and the legend is that the last cadet to fall wrapped himself in the American flag, as seen in this one illustration. So his sense really was that this would make a thrilling film, and especially showing the sacrifice of these young men. In some ways, I think he really hoped that someone would see the book and contact him and make the movie. In other ways, perhaps not. But interestingly, it's not necessarily a forgotten screenplay, because when I was poking around for some information about him, I came across a citation. So about 20 years ago, a doctoral student at the Colegio de Mexico did write a solid journal article how this screenplay fits in with that period's notion of Mexican history and culture. Some of what are screenplays are actually, they don't technically have what you see with the screenplay with the names of the different figures and their lines going through the page. Some of them were novelized, and this is one, Tierras Vírgenes, which was novelized, but in its, I think somewhere on the recto side of the title page, it had this little quote, argumento novelado por una película de la colonización judía en la República Argentina en homenaje. So this again would be an interesting investigation, someone to take a deep dive to, can they find out any more? Again, why did it end up not being published and instead ended up being novelized. And of course, you know, we can think the easy answer is always a screenplay didn't get filmed because there wasn't enough money. And that's true enough for some of these, but again, there's some other issues as to why some screenplays have been produced. So we also have screenplays as literary experimentation. The Brazilian, fairly obscure author that I could find almost no information except her when she passed away, Ida Laura. She had 3 film screenplay published in the Brazilian cultural journal Anhembi in the 1960s. And the editor of the journal noted her screenplay should be read more as poetry than cinema, even though the text was produced in a screenplay format. Another one, just kind of interesting or brings a chuckle, is 4 writers in the 1940s produced a screenplay. They were hoping that the comic actor Cantinflas would pay attention to and pick up. No one really knows if that happened, but it eventually appeared in the 1951 issue of America, a Mexican magazine that Efrain Hernandez, one of the writers, also was the editor of. And the fact that they put in this caricature that has a Cantinflas resemblance says, you know, they really hope so. But everything I've read, Cantinflas' son noted, number one, his father only did 1 movie a year, because if he did 2, he lost money. Better to make 1 movie a year, have everybody attending it, and then release the next movie. His son said, you know, he constantly received screenplays for consideration, ignored most of them. So whether or not this is one he saw and said thank you but no thank you, we don't know. A cinematic mystery that I have some skin in the game on is a shooting script that I bought in the 1990s from Howard Carno Books with several others from Mexico. They had just found, and it is just called Santo el Enmascarado de Plata. And I assumed it really was one of the films that got made. Just very carelessly put it into the manuscript. So just a few years ago, I was going back through it and I thought, now, is that really true? By then I was at FIU, so I got it on interlibrary loan. Thank goodness UGA still has it on the shelf. But I looked at it and went to the Great Encyclopedia of Mexican Film by Emilio Garcia Riera. And it doesn't match up. The very first Santo film was a serial, but it was a 12-part serial, and the chapter titles don't match up to this text at all. So again, some interesting, and it was anonymous. It had official stamps all over the place for copyright, but I couldn't tell, though, from the handwriting, if there was something that I couldn't tell if the signature was perhaps the author's or someone in the copyright office. Going to the University of Iowa a few years ago, because I found a number of archival shooting scripts there, and this was through WorldCat. So of all people, that in this collection is Academy Award winner Guillermo del Toro with the rather salient title La Burro Caliente de Tijuana, the Great Tijuana Donkey Love Act. I won't say anything more about that, but I couldn't resist finding a little illustration for it. So if Guillermo del Toro ever shows up in Oklahoma City to do a Q&A as a well-known director, I'm going to be there, and I'm going to be raising my hand to ask, okay, what's up with the Donkey Love Act script? Now, I'll get through this section and say that this is where dreams do come true. Now, we already had the example from Cine de Violencia that 3 of its submissions were eventually filmed. In 2012, the Mexican publisher Altamira published 4 film screenplays, and in their foreword for each volume said, with the hope these literary works would find their way to the screen. So I did one day a few years ago, I did one massive search of everything that was claiming to be unfilmed to see if anything had happened. And son of a gun, Itzel Lara's Distancias Cortas got made into a movie. So that's, dreams do come true. I'll just go ahead. I'm about to close and we'll have time for questions and answers. When I was in library school, there was a real sense of, while librarians should be aware of the opportunities for writing, for doing research, they should really not be doing too many bibliographies, because everybody expected librarians to do them and they wanted to be taken seriously. So this is my made up little quote: bibliographies are a no-no from the Interlibrary Police Federation, if you remember Philip Baker Hall from a Seinfeld episode as library police. So this is my manual for librarians who want to be taken seriously, circa 1977. The other part of this too is that bibliographies may be considered the buggy whips of librarianship, that they're no longer published. People say that today. Well, they don't publish bibliographies. In the United States, major publishers are publishing few, if not any of them. That is certainly true. They still exist in journal articles, and they still continue to be published around the world, especially in Latin America, in the Caribbean, and in Spain. But I think they do serve a purpose, and they become valid research in their own right. There is a lot of information I had to cull together to make the bibliography believable, to point from one title to another that had a relationship. But bibliographies can serve to cover a unique topic or format, and sometimes perhaps for the first time, which is the case of this bibliography. They can bring things together scattered across databases, and in my case, since I've had the good fortune of doing a little traveling, going beyond databases to things. WorldCat shows us routinely not everything is in the United States. So, this is another opportunity to bring something into light, even if now trying to get it down the road might still be a challenge, but nonetheless, you want to know it's there. So just one other observation I'll quickly make is I also started thinking about whether or not this bibliography was going to end up showing us a canon of Latin American and Caribbean films. Ultimately, I don't think it does. It certainly does have its share of screenplays of what would be considered some of the important films. Los Olvidados, Memorias del Subdesarrollo, La Oficial. But there are so many other films that I think are lesser known, and certainly some I would like to see, but I don't think really ever made it over in the 80s and 90s through, when VHS was the king and we were dying for them to VHS distributors to produce Latin American films and videos. And canon can be a loaded word, because who's creating the canon? And again, this is, is it us, the US viewers influenced by the foreign film circuit outside of that region? Or is it viewers in situ in the region who understand certain films as indicative of their history and reality? So in that respect, I would say this is not necessarily a canon, but it does point to both important and lesser known films that can certainly, I think, be of benefit to film scholars. So I will stop talking at this point, and I'll put in a couple of illustrations. That's a whole nother story. I wanted to have illustrations and it just didn't work out for a couple of reasons. But I will stop sharing and get my face back up on the screen, and we are now open to questions and comments you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Gayle, so much. I mean, this has been a work of decades, and I'm sure, I mean, you will continue, right?
I'm probably, yeah. When I was in Colombia for the book fair, I made 2 side trips to Medellin and Cali to look at some more archival shooting scripts for the 2nd edition. So yeah, I do have a little 2nd edition going. Socrates, you have a question. Please unmute.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about discovery and then also the kind of material condition of the screenplays as they were presented. Like, are they, some of them, are they in loose leaf? Are they bound? How have libraries dealt with them as materials in their collections? Have they been put in shelves, or are they in are you coming across those in like finding aids and archival collections? I was just wondering kind of if you could give us a sense of some of that. Thank you.
Okay, well, that means we're still talking about it both in terms of that dividing line between commercially published works and archival shooting scripts. So for what were really commercially published books, they're in, they're what you would expect to see from Latin American publishers, primarily soft cover. Again, a lot of them do include lots of great supplemental material about the making of the film, lots of film stills, credits, and so on. Now, the archival shooting scripts, yes, those are another matter. And the ones I found, and again, we're really through WorldCat. Again, I was really just, I was looking for anything and everything pertaining to being a Latin American and Caribbean screenplay. And that's when I started finding these. And it was just a matter of any that I could cover for this bibliography. I was able to. I covered just about everything I had. I say the exception were one or two from the Pacific Film Archive in San Francisco or Berkeley. I always get the location mixed up. But they're primarily sitting in special collections, so they do get treated quite well. I don't think I saw any that are loose, that are unbound pages. Everything was bound in some way or not. Ones out of Mexico tended to have their own binding there. Now, the ones I looked at Princeton University, Firestone Library, that Peter Johnson had purchased from the Argentine director, Maria Luisa Bemberg, those were in what I think were what Princeton used for binding its pamphlets and loose materials. It was very uniform. And when I think about it now, it wasn't that I tried to look on them to see if they had a manufacturer's name like Denison, but I would think that those might have been loose. Some of them weren't in great shape. Some, I would say, like at the University of California at Santa Cruz, what I saw there were primarily Cuban scripts that had been donated by the film scholar Juliana Burton Cruz once she retired from teaching there, and she mainly focused on Cuba. So some of those were mimeographed and were to the point you had to hold them up to the light so you could make out a word. So they were, I would say all of them were in very good condition. And we're given special collections type archival treatment. So I hope that answers your question. Great. Katie.
Hi, well, thank you, Gayle. First of all, I thought that was fascinating. It was so great to hear more about the project after seeing it in digital format. And I'm really happy you had the last slide about kind of the utility of bibliography nowadays, because that's something I've wanted to talk to you about for a while. In terms of like, as someone who, has done their schooling and their career in the internet age, bibliography, at least when I was in library school, that wasn't something that was pushed. But it's interesting that you said even back when you were in library school as well, it wasn't something that was encouraged. So I wanted to ask you about, in terms of your travel for this project, because I know you were just in Colombia not too long ago, in terms of like how you made decisions, because obviously, we're all limited by our employment and budget and all that. So like you pick where you go strategically. In terms of like, I guess I want to know like, why did you go to Columbia and what you did beforehand? Like, did you like look up things, and did the institutions you go to have online catalogs? And so I guess that's my question. Like, why did you go to Columbia, and what brought you to Columbia, I guess?
Well, the most recent trip was, the major reason was to attend the Bogota Book Fair. But this is not the first time I've done that. My previous trip to Bogota for the book fair in, I don't know, 2017 or 2018, I had done the same thing. And I'll just to backpedal a little, after searching through WorldCat and finding so much that was especially in the US, but also finding some holdings were not in US libraries, then it became, how do I get my hands on some of these? And I was also starting to go into all online catalogs throughout the region, universities, the national libraries. So in particular, so I've still got that stack of stuff. So the last time I had gone for the National Library of Colombia was because they had several titles from a series that a group of Colombian film directors had made, but they didn't distribute them commercially. They passed them among themselves, so there are very few of them held in US libraries. I luckily called on the Montalvos to see if they bring them in. So FIU has a good collection of them. And again, a couple of other places in the US do it as well. But essentially, they also had a Venezuelan screenplay, and that pointed to another group of titles there. Starting in the 1980s, I believe, there was a Fundación de Cine Latinoamericano that had started publishing Venezuelan screenplays, but it was very sporadic, and sometimes it looked like they were the publisher, but then they had another publisher as their distributor, and they're not. So it turned out I kept stumbling on those of, some of the titles. It was like I knew off the top of my head, oh yeah, that's one I've still got to look for. Others like, oh, I don't have this one in my listings. So it was going to those places. When I went to Lima for the Latin American Studies Association, that was the year before, perhaps in 2017, I was hoping to go to the National Library of Peru that also had some things that were not in WorldCat at all, but I just didn't have the time. Plus I was hoping, since LASA took place out at the Catholic University campus, I thought maybe I could duck into one of the libraries there that had a couple of those titles. Well, it turned out LASA was there because that was their intermission or inter-semester break period for the Pontificia, so the libraries were closed. So there were things like that. But I also managed to go when we had in Mexico City in 2018. I spent my last day going to the Cineteca Nacional to use their library. And again, I think they had another Venezuelan title is the only place I could get my hands on it. So I got the second Dan Hazen Research Fellowship to make a trip in 2015, starting at the University of California in Riverside. They had the collection of, now I can't think of his name, but their special collections included the works by this interesting guy who was either German or Polish, Traven, who wrote Treasure of the Sierra Madre, but they had a number of things he also wrote from cinema. And when I was getting ready for that trip, and I got the funding just to go there, and it was like, well, it means this will be like a 2-day trip or 3-day at most. So I went through the UC Library System catalog Melville, thinking as long as I'm in the area, I can stretch this out to a whole week. Maybe I'll need to go to UCLA or Berkeley or wherever. Well, I had everything in terms of the printed screenplays that the California libraries held. What I didn't have were those Julianne Burton donations up at UC Santa Cruz. So that involved me getting up at 5 in the middle of the week and leaving Riverside and doing an all-day drive through the high desert and the mountains and ending up by the seashore at a very nice hotel, so I could go the next day to special collections at UC Santa Cruz. And if you haven't read it yet, read my preface and my acknowledgments. I have one in there pertaining to that trip. I won't go into details here, but it was a shout out to another SALALM member, now retired, Walter Brem, who curated my driving directions for me. But take a look at that acknowledgement and you'll find out what I'm talking about. But I think, Katie, did I cover your question? I think I did.
Yes, thank you so much.
We have a few more minutes for questions. Don't be shy. We're waiting for another one. Let me ask a question for you, Gayle. I'm very curious about like the scripts that that were included in periodical literature, in magazines, and you highlight in your preface that basically you just touch kind of the tip of the iceberg, right? That you think
Yes,
you're sure that there is more. So my question is like, how do you manage to find those screenplays included in periodicals? Like, what kind of detective techniques did you apply to find them?
First, going through the regular databases, starting with Happy to see if there would be anything. Happy actually had a few citations. I also looked at the Handbook of Latin American Studies because at one point starting I think in the 80s through the early 2000s, they used to, their humanities volume used to include a film section, and then they took it out, and I could never convince them that they needed to keep it. They did, but I think there was almost nothing there, maybe one or two. And then, you know, it really just going through things like the MLA International Bibliography, the of different film journal online indexes that are out there whose names escape me, so yielded very little. At that point, first I started looking at some of the obvious stuff. I knew that Cine Cubano had printed its own index, which I managed. Even though my library holds Cine Cubano, we didn't have the index, and I managed to get it on interlibrary loan and photocopied it. And so that primarily things that were excerpts of screenplays, because when you think about it, a screenplay is very lengthy. So it's not something some people would say, why did you even bother? Because they wouldn't be publishing, but some screenplays are very short. So there are complete screenplays that are published in journals. After that, it was really just, and it was starting to go through some of the National Library stuff. So that was where I hit pay dirt with the National Library of Colombia website, because their Hemeroteca Digital, they had, starting in the 70s, Colombia had a slew of film journals coming out of Bogota and Medellin, a lot of which were short-lived. But but they had those digital collections, and I spent a very happy afternoon several years ago just going through and identifying quite a few of them that did have excerpts, but also lengthier full screenplays. The one I found with the Brazilian writer, I honestly can't remember. Oh, I think I know. She actually had published a book, and the book also referred to her previous writing, her other screenplays in Anyembe, which I was able to get hold of, and except for one of them, and then Anyembe is now digital, I think, at the National Library of Brazil site, or maybe USP, I can't remember, but I was able to find it there. So that's why, you know, so we know that there have been hundreds and thousands of Latin American journals that that even with Happy doing its best, there are so many that were, especially those that are no longer published, that have never been indexed. So it is still a matter of trying to figure out the other ways that I could. I will say, one way I didn't really try, and I should again. Some of you may remember that a few years ago, Melissa Gasparotto published an article about using Google, and there's a special way you can use it to create your own engine for with the very specific terms of what you want to search for. And she had an example of how she had used it for Latin American books. And I'd read the article, tried the parameters just with the phrase in Spanish and Portuguese, first guiones cinematográficos and then roteiros cinematográficos. And that actually yielded several things, though mainly books as opposed to journal articles or text in journals. So for down the road, that may be another area where I want to try, because certain that there's something waiting there along the way.
Thank you, Gayle. Thank you. It definitely always bibliographies never end, right? It's always more things to find, more things to discover. So no,
Yes.
thank you for all your work. And we have, well, it's 3 o'clock here in the Northeast. If we have any kind of short questions, maybe we have time for one more. Otherwise, Gayle, I mean, would you like to kind of say a few more words to kind of wrap it up?
Yes, I think I would. First of all, I want to say thank you to the audience who took the time to participate today. That means a lot to me. But I also understand, as Orchid had pointed out, this is August, so we know, I know schools here in Oklahoma City are starting next week. So for some people, it's that last burst of summer fun. And I completely understand that. I'll go ahead and mention here again, once Orchid had told me it was a go for the manuscript. One thing I told her was that this is about film, so we have to have something visual. And I really did want to put in some reproductions of some of the book titles, and especially the 2 covers of the Vigías. But when I wrote to Vigía on asking permission to, because Orchid, of course, emphasized the importance we had to get permissions from the publishers. The ones who did a Chilean group of screenplays immediately wrote back and said, oh, we'd be very delighted. Please use this phrase to identify them. Vigía wrote back and said, thank you for your interest. We will get back to you. And I never heard from them again. Part of me really wanted to go ahead and stick it in and kind of say, well, screw you. But I know Orchid wouldn't have let me do that. So that's why I don't have any illustrations. So perhaps maybe for the second edition, I can get those in. But I want to say thank you to all of you. I want to say too, I am so happy when Orchid sent me the email that this was finally available through Project Muse, except it still had a couple of boo-boos that we had to fix quickly, which she and the typesetter did, and I'm so grateful for that. But this has been a project that's meant a lot to me. And it's one of those things, I'm a little sad that it's all gone, but again, I'm still thinking down the road will be the second edition, especially when I'll have a little more time as I retire. So I probably should close on that and say again to all of you, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you, Sarah.
So Orchid, yeah, you can stop the recording now. Good job, Gayle. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gayle. Thanks, Jesus. That was great. Really appreciated it.
Good job, Gayle. See you all later.
Okay.
Okay.
Take care.
Bye, everybody. Everybody.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Gayle.
Bye-bye.